For all of you out there with British roots, I'm going to say 3 words that are going to make you smile. Maybe it'll even take you right back to the old country. Are you ready? Bubble and squeak. Almost guarantee that everybody who's British knows exactly what I'm talking about, and they just smiled, and everybody else is thinking, what is he talking about? Have you never heard of bubble and squeak? It's a unique British delicacy. Well, delicacy is kind of a stretch. Basically, you take all of the food scraps from the previous week, potatoes, cabbage, little pieces of beef or sausage, maybe some onions and mushrooms, and instead of throwing them out, you throw them into a big frying pan, take a chunk of butter or lard, fry them all up, and serve them out for dinner. I know it doesn't sound appetizing. It actually is, in all of its artery-clogging goodness. I had many good bubble and squeak dinners growing up, usually on a Sunday night, because it was a crime to throw away perfectly good food. I'm not even sure why it's called bubble and squeak. Maybe somebody out there knows. I'm guessing it's because that's the sound that it makes in the frying pan when you're cooking it up. Bubble and squeak is basically the art of taking what is left over, the scraps, and making them into something that is edible, something that will keep you going. Or to put it simply, bubble and squeak is the culinary art of making something out of nothing. Making something out of nothing. Do you know someone who can make something out of nothing? Of course you do. We all know the artist who can turn a blank canvas into a celebration of color. Or the crafter who can take all those threads of wool and after a few hundred clicks of a knitting needle, make a pair of mittens. How about the poet who can pull words out of the air and put them together in a way that could bring you to tears? Or the carpenter who can take pieces of wood and turn them into a chair or a bed or a cabinet fit for Buckingham Palace. To be able to turn something into nothing is a gift. It's actually God's gift. If you read the Latin translation of the Bible, it begins with the phrase creatio ex nihilo, meaning from nothing came something. From the silence and darkness came the song of life as the Creator created all that we know and love today. And did you know the word for nothingness in Aramaic is the same word that's used for wilderness? It's used many times in Scripture, but specifically twice. One to describe the Israelites' escape from slavery in Egypt to begin their 40-year journey in the wilderness to the Promised Land, and once to describe Jesus removing himself to the wilderness for 40 days where he would be tempted. In both of these situations, it could be read, and they journeyed into nothingness. That kind of gives the story a slightly different flavor. It hints not of a place of lush vegetation or gurgling streams or mighty forests, how we might think of wilderness today, but rather it suggests a place of emptiness, something barren, something devoid from all that was familiar and comfortable, a place not of retreat so much as a place of removal. When I thought of that image, that concept of wilderness as nothingness, I couldn't help but reflect on this past year. Who knew in mid-March 2020 we would suddenly find ourselves in a wilderness, not of our own making, a place suddenly devoid of almost everything we take for granted: connections with others, access to wherever we want to go. For humans who need togetherness, we were told to stay apart. And here we are, a year later, and we're still apart, still in the wilderness. My question to you this morning is, has your wilderness been a place of nothingness? I'm sure at some level, many of us would say yes. That's exactly what it felt like or feels like. Perhaps we can relate very well to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, feeling lost and unmoored and displaced. In fact, lots of parallels can be drawn between the exodus of the Israelites and where we are today. For example, it happened so fast. The Bible tells us the Israelites were literally told one day to gather their stuff, whatever they could carry, and in the middle of the night, gather at the gates of the town, for God was going to show them a way out. Moses was going to lead them out of Egypt. Very quickly, they had to gather all the scraps of their life and leave, including not being able to put the yeast in the bread to leaven it, which is why, of course, at Passover, in the Jewish tradition, it's celebrated with unleavened bread. And yes, they were leaving slavery, but they were also leaving the only life that they had known, leaving behind all that was familiar to go into a place of great uncertainty, to go into nothingness. Does it sound familiar? Didn't it feel like that in March 2020? We were living our lives almost oblivious to what was to come, and then suddenly our screens were filled with the faces of our political leaders, barely containing their own fear, telling us that we needed to come home, go home, hunker down, because something of great consequence was about to descend on us. And it did. And we all remember how we felt in those first few days. Soon the immediacy of that fear would give way to more of a longer-term anxiety as we realized that we would be in this wilderness for a long time to come, hopefully not 40 years. That we are in a wilderness is not in question. We all feel it. We can all relate to that image. We all feel like we are in a place that we never expected to be. But again, my question this morning is, how has your wilderness been? Has it been a place of nothingness? Or has it offered something back? Let me explain what I mean. When we think about the Israelites being in the wilderness for 40 years, what do we think that was like? How do we picture that time? We almost imagine them walking around, bumping into trees, looking at their map, wondering where on earth they are, hopelessly lost. I'm sure it was nothing like that at all. It wasn't a lost time as much as it was an in-between time. It was wilderness, but it wasn't nothingness. Babies were still being born. People were still getting married. Lives were still being lived. It was, you could argue, actually a time of preparation, a time of renewal. It was a time to purge from their lives years of a slavery mentality in which they felt no control over their lives or their future, and instead develop a faith mentality in which they could begin to feel empowered, maybe even begin to feel excited about their future. It was in the wilderness that they learned to rely on God and each other. When they were hungry, they learned to live on the natural provision of the world around them. When they were scared, they looked to the heavens. It says in Exodus that God put a cloud in the sky during the day and a pillar of fire at night to guide them. It was in the wilderness that Moses received the 10 Commandments, giving that community of people the stability that they so badly needed. It was the wilderness that prepared them for life that was to come in the promised land. They entered the wilderness broken, displaced, worried. They exited the wilderness as a cohesive community, stronger, more grounded than they had ever been, and much more deeply connected to their faith in God and each other. I guess my point is, wilderness times are difficult times. We don't seek them out, and we don't want them. But they don't have to be times of nothingness. They can be times of awakening, preparation, creativity. Maybe times to realign our priorities or actually deepen our connection with God or our faith in each other. You can throw away the scraps, or you could make bubble and squeak. I read the remarkable story this week of John Milton, the poet who lived in the 1600s. At the age of 22, John Milton was an aspiring young poet, a writer with a tremendous gift. Instead of honing his gift, however, he threw himself into politics. Driven by anger at the monarchy, he joined Oliver Cromwell's rebellion against the king, which resulted in the English Civil War. Not only did he fight, he became an advocate for a free press, the rights of divorce, and above all, the execution of tyrants. By 1660, the rebellion was crushed and Charles II took the throne. Milton was now an enemy of the crown. All of his books were burned. His power was taken away. He'd also burned out his own health. He'd even lost his eyesight. Disgraced, broke, in bad health, and blind, he figured his life was over. And then in 1665, a pandemic swept through England. People were forced into quarantine, much like we are today. Milton was forced to spend his days cooped up in a small cottage in the wilderness around London. His only company was a Quaker minister by the name of Thomas Elwood. Milton, with nothing now left to do, pulled out the threads of a poem that he'd been working on in his youth, a poem about the fall of Adam and Eve. It was a poem about brokenness, isolation, but also of resilience and faith, things Milton knew only too well. And as Elwood wrote, the blind Milton poured his heart and soul into those words of poetry that included lines like, what in me that is dark, illumine. What is low, raise up. In 1667, the pandemic now past, Milton returned to London, and his poem, Paradise Lost, was published, going on to become one of the great classics of its time, or really of any time. One of the great works of art, Paradise Lost, came from wilderness times, came from nothing. Bubble and squeak. Interestingly enough, so did one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, King Lear. That was also written while Shakespeare was in quarantine during a pandemic. Pandemics aren't new. Now, I'm not idealizing wilderness times, not at all. They are hard, they're difficult, they're heartbreaking times, and we've all faced enough heartbreak. But they don't have to be nothing times. They can be places that give birth, that create, that allow thoughts to be harnessed and gifts to be shared. And we don't have to look to the Miltons and the Shakespeares of history to be inspired by wilderness times. We just have to look around us. I've been following a guy on Facebook who is from Alliston. I knew him a little when I lived in Beaton. His name is Ken, and he's a real estate agent. When the pandemic started, he wanted to do what many people did at first, and every day he was going to go out onto his front porch and bang pots at 7:30, which of course was the shift change at the hospital. It was a way to support the doctors and nurses and healthcare workers. Maybe you even did that for a while yourself. You might assume, like everyone else, he would do it for a day or two and then move on. He didn't. He did it for the past 365 days, every single day at 7:30 p.m. And he filmed it all and put it on Facebook. At first, just a handful of people tuned in, but then it started to grow because people are attracted to what is positive. Before long, dozens of people were tuning in to support this one man's attempt to keep people's spirits up. On day 365, which was last week, even the renowned singer John Doddington, who also lives in Alliston, stood on Ken's front lawn and sang a beautiful song. Ken chose to make something out of nothing. Bubble and squeak. The poet Aldo Leopold once wrote, "To those devoid of imagination, a blank place on a map is a useless waste. To others, it's the most valuable part." And you know what was true of the Israelites in the Old Testament in their 40-year march in the wilderness could also be said of Jesus' own 40-day time in the wilderness. It was also a time of communion with God. But instead of looking for God around him like the Israelites did, Jesus went deep to seek God within him. It says that he removed himself for 40 days, going without the comforts, including without food. And during that time, it said he was confronted by the devil, who came armed with temptations. Was the devil an actual being? Perhaps. Or could it be that what Jesus was actually facing off against in that wilderness was his own demons, his own doubts or temptations? Perhaps with a sense of his growing power, he found himself at a crossroads. He could use that power to build himself up or take care of himself or fuel his ego or feather his nest. The devil inside him taunted him. So into the wilderness he went and did battle with those voices, those impulses, maybe confronted his own ego, and instead placed all that he had in the hands of God, and he came out committed to the greater good. Jesus' time in the wilderness was not nothingness. It was a time to renew his resilience, tame his temptations, and carve out his calling. He took the scraps of all the messages that he'd been given and wove them into a mission that for the next 3 years he would live with passion and purpose. He made something out of nothing. Bubble and squeak. Last fall in downtown Edmonton, dandelions started popping up all over the place. They didn't grow there. They were put there by an artist called Monique Martin. She made them all out of paper. She believed the dandelion, that although dismissed as a weed, is one of the hardiest, most resilient plants in the world. It can bloom almost anywhere. She said she put them there in the hopes that people will look at them and think, I could be like that dandelion. I can be in places that are tough and hard for me, but I can still thrive. We've all been in wilderness times where we're not sure of which way to go or what's happening or what's going to become of us. Like the Israelites wandering for 40 years or Jesus wandering for 40 days. The time isn't what matters. It's what we do with it. They can be nothing times, or they can be times of great clarity, creativity, or renewed purpose. They can be places where we wrestle with demons or deepen our sense of self, or maybe even climb the mountain like Moses and seek the will of God. Or like Milton or Shakespeare, they can open up creative space in which we can pour ourselves into something that will outlive our wilderness times. Or like my friend Ken, they can be times when we harness our love for one another. We are in a collective wilderness, and we have been for a long time. The end is in sight. And soon the wilderness will give way to something so much better. But for now, how are we going to use this time? Can we harness the creative power of God? Make this nothing time into something. Maybe put pen to paper, brush to canvas, seed to earth, saw to wood. Don't throw away this time by decrying the nothingness, but turn it into somethingness. Joseph was a tailor, and a very good tailor was he. People would bring all of their clothes for Joseph to fix. Joseph had a beautiful big coat that he wore with him everywhere he went. He loved that coat. His wife, Sarah, didn't love it quite so much. After a while, the bottom of Joseph's coat became frayed, and so he went home and he said to his wife, "Oh, Sarah, my favorite coat is frayed. It's broken. What should I do?" And Sarah said, "Joseph, you might want to think about throwing it away." Joseph said, "I'm not going to throw it away. I'm a tailor." So he cut and he snipped, and he snipped and he cut, and he turned that coat into a beautiful vest that he wore with him everywhere he went. After a while, the pocket on the vest became ripped. And so he went home and he said to his wife, Sarah, "Oh, Sarah, my favorite vest is ruined. What am I going to do?" And Sarah said, "Joseph, throw it away." He says, "I'm not going to throw it away. I'm a tailor." And he snipped and he cut and he cut and he snipped and he turned that vest into a scarf. And he proudly wrapped that scarf around his neck and he wore it everywhere he went. But after a while, the scarf too became rather old and frayed. And he came home and he said, "Sarah, my favorite scarf is ruined. What am I going to do?" Sarah said, "Joseph, please throw it away." He said, "I'm not going to throw it away. I'm a tailor." And he snipped and he cut and he cut and he snipped and he turned that scarf into a beautiful tie. And he wore that tie to the temple and all around the place where he would go. But after a while, that tie became kind of stained and old. And he came home and he said, "Oh, Sarah, my favorite tie is ruined. What am I going to do?" Sarah said, "Joseph, for Pete's sake, please throw it away." He said, "I'm not going to throw it away. I'm a tailor." And he snipped and he cut and he cut and he snipped and he turned that tie into a little handkerchief that he put in his pocket. And he wore that handkerchief proudly everywhere he went. And after a while, even that handkerchief became old and worn. And he went home and he said, "Sarah, my favorite handkerchief is ruined. What am I going to do?" And Sarah said, "Joseph, for Pete's sake, please just throw it away." Joseph said, "I'm not going to throw it away. I'm a tailor." And he snipped and he cut and he cut and he snipped. And he turned that handkerchief into a button that he sewed on and he wore on his shirt. One day he was walking along the road and the button popped off, rolled along the road, down into a sewer, and it was gone. And he came home and he said, "Sarah, my favorite button is gone." And Sarah said, "Hallelujah, because even you can't make something out of nothing." He said, "You want to bet? Not only am I a tailor, but I'm a storyteller." He took a pencil and a piece of paper, and he wrote down the story so that it would never be forgotten. When we come out of this, we will all have a story to tell. What will your story be? Will it be a sad story? A story of frustration? Or will you tell of the time that you gathered up all the scraps and made something out of nothing? Will you tell the time that you made Bubble and Squeak? Amen.